Sunday?
Yeah.
That's what my grandmother was. She lived on Willing, which is, my mom lived on 6th.
Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for braving the weather and coming out today. My name is Devin Pipes. I'm on the board of the Sanger Area Historical Society, and this is Diane and Chip and Betty Lou and Linda. They're all board members. Our president, Tona Bates, she had a surgery and she's still recovering, so keep her in your thoughts and prayers. She wasn't able to be here tonight, but she's with us in spirit and she'll watch the video later. But anyways, I just want to show everybody, in case you don't know about us, we're the Sanger Area Historical Society. We've got a little museum right next door. And I wanted to show you some of the books we have. This is Songs of Sanger by Idalene Fuqua, and she wrote a bunch of articles for the Sanger paper, and they're all historical articles about Sanger, and they were compiled into a book. We've got copies of these for sale next door. We also have a recipe book from Sanger, and our Around Sanger book with lots of historical pictures and information about Sanger. Those are all available next door. And tonight we have some more of the thumb drives with our yearbook scans. We've been scanning, there's 62, 64 yearbooks, something like that, on the thumb drive. All the proceeds are going towards scanning the rest of the yearbooks that have not yet been scanned. And so if you buy them, it's 20 or 25?
20.
$20 for a thumb drive, and it's got our logo and Sanger Indians logo. So it's a neat little deal. Christmas is coming up, so keep that in mind. You just come see Betty Lou, she's got them over here. We also have some brochures. It's got a lot of information about the Historical Society, where you can find out about upcoming meetings and some of our historical resources that we've digitized and put online. So be sure and grab one of those for you. Let's see, do I have any other announcements today? I don't think so. We don't have another meeting on the books as of right now, but we'll maybe come up with something and have something fun next year. There's some cookies. The restrooms are on the hallway back towards the outside door if you need to go. So I want to introduce our speaker, Dr. Tom McDonald. He wrote this book, Texas Rangers, Ranchers, and Realtors, the James Hughes Callahan and the Day family in the Guadalupe River Basin. I came across the book because I do family history research, and there's about 18 of my relatives in this book that were Texas Rangers alongside Dr. McDonald's relatives. And so it's just, I've read it and was totally blown away by the wonderful detail and research that he's put into it, and wanted to have him come and tell us about not only the story of his family, who was very important in early Texas history, but also a little bit about how he went about doing the research and compiling such an impressive book. And so anyways, thank you, Dr. McDonald, and this is from the Historical Society.
Thank you very much. So beginning when I was 13 years old, it's been 1955, my grandfather, when I would sit on his front porch, he would tell me about my ancestors. And this happened periodically until he died in 1979. And I decided then that when I retired, I'd see if what he told me was truthful or not. And that's what started me on this journey. I'm not a historian. I'm a scientist. I worked for a pharmaceutical in Fort Worth all my life, 39 years, from from 1965 to 2004. And after that, I spent 5 years as a consultant for Nestle Nutrition. And then I started writing this book in 2009. It took me 12 years and 3 months from that point until it was published. I didn't know anything about writing a book. And that's what I learned. I look at this as 3 journeys. I learned about the journey to learn about my ancestors. I learned a lot about U.S., Texas, and Mexican history that I didn't know. And I learned about the process of becoming an author. And so that's what, to give you some background and some understanding of what I experienced in going through writing this book. I chose a theme of family. It is the Callahan and Day family. I chose a space, and that is the Guadalupe River Basin, and I chose a time of 1820 up until about 1860. Now there's events outside of that, but generally it occurs during this period of time. The space is, of course, here, the Guadalupe River Basin. This happens to be one of the characters in the book. Her name is Sarah Medissa Day. This photograph was probably made about 1855. Her husband, James Hughes Callahan, his photograph was made, but we've lost it. Anyway, that was the part of the family, and this was the space, the Guadalupe River Basin. Here are some other personalities that my grandfather would tell me about. James Clinton Nell. He was the commander of the Alamo until February the 6th, when he decided he was fed up with he couldn't get supplies, and he decided he would go to Sam Houston and see if he could get supplies, and he turned the command over to Travis. Another branch of the family is of Francis and Sarah Elizabeth Berry. They came as a part of the DeWitt colony in about 1830, more or less. Johnson and Sarah Hembry Day are a major thread throughout this book. They are the father of Sarah Medissa Day. I wanted to know everything about these people, and that took me down many different avenues, and I spent a lot of time studying about who they were. I not only wanted to know who they were, but who were their relatives before they came here. So it's brought me back to studying about history in the eastern part of the United States. The Callahans came to Texas through James Hughes Callahan, but the Callahans were settled mainly in Georgia. They came from North Carolina, and they bought land that had been a part of the Cherokee nation. If you're real familiar, if you may not be familiar with, I was not, about the Cherokee Nation, they owned almost all the land in Texas, in Georgia, and eastern Tennessee, and of course it was the Americans who pushed the Cherokees out, and one of the places that they left land was what was occupied by the Callahans. James Hughes Callahan was one of several sons and daughters of James Callahan. James Callahan was a tenant farmer. He lived on 160 acres. I don't know how he raised crops to feed his family. All of his sons became mechanics. They built and repaired wagons. And I followed them until they died, most of them, and they decided they were not going to be farmers. The daughters married men who turned out not to be farmers. But anyway, they settled on land in Cherokee land in northeastern Georgia. When Texas decided to separate from Mexico, it created a hullabaloo, not only in Texas, but particularly in the southern part of the United States. And there was lobbying on people in Texas sending letters and reports back about the conditions in Mexico and Texas and why they needed to be independent. And the newspapers are full of this. And many men organized and decided they would come to Texas. One was a Georgia Battalion. This is not a very well-known group of men that came to Texas. It was formed by Colonel Ward. And he gathered his men, and they left Georgia. I followed every step of the way. There are newspaper accounts and are written accounts and diaries about, and I could follow everywhere they were every day. They traveled down the river from in eastern Alabama to Mobile, Alabama, took a ship over to New Orleans, and they took another ship from New Orleans to Velasco, Texas. All of this I could document by looking at ship manifests and passengers. And I could document that Callahan was among these and many of the other men who were known to be a part of the Georgia Battalion. When they arrive in Velasco, they're assigned to Fannin. And eventually they congregate in Goliad. By now, the Mexican army had invaded. Most of us are familiar with Santa Ana invading in the central part of Texas and headed towards San Antonio. Another arm came up the eastern edge of Texas towards Goliad. A town south of Goliad was Refugio, where a lot of women were then staying because their men were a part of the Texas Army, and Fannin sent the Georgia Battalion to rescue them. This becomes a really intriguing and interesting story several people have written about. Nevertheless, over the period of time, they get into a fight with the Mexican government, decide they were going to escape, and they spend several days marching north. They hear actually the Battle of Goliad, where the Coletta Creek, where the Fannin men were captured. And then they end up being captured themselves, and Callahan is a prisoner of the Mexican army. They take them to a village, and most of the men are marched south to Goliad. He was held back to repair boats because he was a carpenter. And it's the only reason his life was saved. He was there until the Texas Army defeated Mexico and they passed through it, and somehow he escaped. And he got his discharge papers and went back to Georgia. That's a brief summary of the Georgia Battalion that I cover extensively in the book. Going back to another part of the family, I've talked about the Days and the Hembrys. I follow these people, their grandmothers and grandfathers, great-mother and grandfathers from Virginia, Tennessee, and Texas. And one of the themes that united these people were their devotion to the Methodist and Baptist Church. And it is a constant theme throughout the book. In fact, my grandfather was a very devout Methodist guy, and I'm absolutely certain he was because it began back at this particular time. But anyway, James Hembry had a daughter. Her name was excuse me for a moment, but he had a daughter, and she was the mother of Sarah Medessa Day. She married Johnson Day. Her name was Sarah Hembry Day. And Johnson Day had a difficulty with his alcohol. And he would, and she was very religious. And her father was at the age of 50, decided he was going to be an evangelic minister. He lived until 90, by the way, so he spent 40 years preaching. And he was hard shell. And he had difficulty accepting his son-in-law. His son-in-law, James Day, traveled about. They moved about because they moved about and they'd get to a church, and if you get in trouble with the church members, and he would move on. And eventually, they ended up moving to Tennessee, and after the Texas Revolution, they came to Texas, first settling in San Augustine, Texas, and then they moved to Gonzales. This led me to understand, I studied about the religion in this, particularly in the southern part of the United States. The awakenings, are you familiar with the first and the second and third awakenings? I was not. These are religious revivals that occurred that consumed the population of the United States during the time that they existed. Nevertheless, the Days and the Hembrews end up in Gonzales. And this was in 1837. So it was after the Texas Revolution. Johnson Day becomes a justice of the peace. And there are no churches. There is no one to control his taste for alcohol. In fact, he dies in the summer. He dies of dysentery. And when I look at his probate, he owed the grocery stores a lot of money for alcohol that he bought. But anyway, he dies in 1837. But his daughter, Sarah Medissa Day, is very sick. By that time, 2 of his children had married, and Sarah Medissa Day had married a William Alsbury. William Alsbury is a part of the famous Alsbury family of San Antonio. William Alsbury, he could not stay still. And she claimed that he abandoned her when she was sick. But after Johnson Day dies, his wife is a widow. She has 1 son, 5 daughters living with her. 3 of the children are married, and the other 3 girls are not. And they moved to Seguin, and they're part of the founding members of the town of Seguin. This was an incorporated town. She was the only woman who was a member of the incorporation, and she would vote when they had meetings. Now, this was a business, not government, but I claim she was the first woman that voted in Texas. But, and she builds a ranger house. You'll see it in a little bit. She builds a ranger house. It was there until, when was it turned down, Michael?
2000, I believe.
Until recently, 20 or 30 years ago. It was torn down. And, but anyway, she built a house, and it became the ranger house. It was on the western edge of Seguin. All that she looked at was the prairie land. And it became, with 3 unmarried daughters, you can imagine it attracted a lot of men, particularly the men who signed up to be rangers. And when the rangers would congregate, they did at her house and became the ranger house. It also became the first hospital in in Seguin. I cover extensively the Indian raids that occurred at this time, and there are several adventures with her children and the other in-laws that she had. I'm going back to the Georgia Battalion again. They started out in Midgeville, and this is the route that they took all the way to New Orleans and to Velasco, Texas. As I said, I documented it clearly by looking at passenger manifests on the various ships that they traveled on. They were in the Battle of Refugio against the Mexican army. They held themselves up in a church and escaped at midnight one night, and they traveled this route. All of this I was able to figure out where they were from various accounts that were written about this time, and they were captured here and in March and carried back to Victoria, Texas, where Callahan was placed under arrest as a carpenter, and the rest were sent to Goliad. Most of the Georgia Battalion were killed in the massacre at Goliad. Here's the ranger house that she was built. This photograph was probably made shortly after the World War II. A family lived in this house, at least I can document, up until about 1960. the young lady that lived there, she's about my age now, she told me about how the house appeared and about some of the events of the house. But anyway, this is the Ranger house. This is what Seguin looked like in 1845. The Ranger house is in this area here. This drawing was made by a member of the U.S. Corps of Engineers, and it's one of the first drawings are of Seguin. A lot of events happened around Seguin. It was on the frontier, not too far from San Antonio. There were no settlements west of it until the Germans came and settled at New Braunfels. In 1840, there was a famous Comanche Indian raid that occurred all the way down to near Victoria, Texas. And after that, the Texas Republic made a strong effort to neutralize or prevent raids by themselves organizing and attacking particularly the Comanche Indians. One was the Howard Campaign of 1840. James Hughes Callahan by now had returned from Georgia. According to the family legend, he had a failed love life. And he came back to Texas. He knew he had lots of land available, and he came back to Texas, and he settled somewhere in this area between Gonzales and Victoria. And after the famous Comanche raid in the fall of 1840, he joined the Howard Campaign, which was one of the campaigns that punished the Comanche Indians. And this is an outline of what where the Howard Campaign traveled during that period of time. After the Howard Campaign, he decided that he would settle in San Antonio, but he found out there were too many people from Mexico there, he couldn't handle it. So he went to Seguin, and his horse was lame, and he stopped there. Bought a piece of land in the town, and this is where he met Sarah Medissa Day. Now, Sarah Medissa Day was married at the time.
Yeah.
Her husband had run off. She wasn't sure where he was. We now know he was in Matamoros, Mexico. He had married again. Anyway, she fell in love with James Hughes Callahan and decided she needed a divorce. So she filed for a divorce in the December of 1841. At that time, divorces were handled by the district court. And she was waiting for the court to hold its session in the spring of 1842. That's when the Mexican army invaded and the district court wasn't held. And in fact, her attorney was one of the men arrested and captured by the Mexicans and hauled back to Mexico. District court was canceled. It was canceled in 1842 when the wall invasion occurred. Now she's desperate, and she's pregnant. So she filed with this, at that time, you could file with the Texas legislature, the legislature of the Republic of Texas, and there were many other people in the same boat. And they approved every one of them except one man decided he didn't want to approve these, and they were all unapproved. Now they're both desperate, and she finally gets a divorce in March of 1843, and they marry a few days later. Anyway, during this time is the wall invasion, and Callahan joins and fights against the wall invasion. But like many Texans, he decided that he was not going to invade in Mexico, and he decided that he would return back home, which he did. I told you about divorce. She would file for divorce. If my grandfather knew that she was divorced, he would have had a lot of kittens. He was, I told you, an evangelic Methodist. So this got me looking. I told you I learned about Texas history. If I ask you how many divorces do you think occurred in the Republic of Texas, how many of you said there were, or do you thought there were many or not many? I'm curious.
I'm not any.
There were more than you imagined, really. Okay? And these are the only studies I could find on divorce in Texas. About the only way you could get a divorce is if you conceived adultery or cruelty or abandonment. Anyway, she was one of the 6 wives that filed for divorce in Gonzales County during this time, during the Republic of Texas. I studied all of the divorce cases in Gonzales County, and I covered them, not extensively, but enough to give you a flavor of how it must have been exciting to try to get a divorce in Texas at that time. Seguin grows into a modern village. This is a painting. This painting was made in 1853 by a lady that had come to Texas with her husband. He was going to be a land developer. And they lived west of Seguin, and she painted this Seguin. Look at it. Painted buildings. These are macadamianized roads. Look at the people are dressed rather nicely. The town had changed in 10 years, almost a little less than 10 years, from a log cabin village to a outstanding community. In fact, it was said that it had one of the best schools in the entire state of Texas. Now, I discussed extensively, I'm not here tonight, about education in Texas during this period of time, and Seguin was one of the prominent leaders providing an education for children. It is a good example of the public's interest to support and build public schools and support education for children. So this was Seguin in 1853. At this time, James Hughes Callahan and Sarah Medissa Day had married, were having children, and they and his in-laws and his mother-in-law, they all bought land in Guadalupe County, and they settled on the land generally in this area. But in 48 or 49, James Hughes Callahan and his wife moved to Prairie Lead along the San Marcos River. It is just inside the county line of Caldwell County. He gives land to the Methodist camp meeting. He contributes land to the school. He becomes a member of the county commissioner court. He still wasn't satisfied. He wanted to be a land entrepreneur, and he and several other, and so he and this moved to a town called Pittsburgh on the Blanco River. It's a branch of the San Marcos San Marcos River. He moved to Pittsburgh. That was Comal County at that time. Today it's Blanco County. And just across the north side of the Blanco River is what is today the town of Blanco. I'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. So they moved to Blanco. He buys one section, 4,000 some odd acres, and he buys one half of another section. He has 6,000 acres of land. Actually, he's partnership with several people on the on the 4,400 acres. And he entices several people to move to this part of the world. Devin talked earlier about several of his relatives down there. This is where most of them are mentioned in the book, by the way. They live nearby. So then now he decides he's going to become a land entrepreneur, a very typical traditional Texas activity. He needed money. Living by was Michael Erskine. Michael Erskine had migrated from, and I followed his family also, had migrated to Texas shortly after the Texas Revolution. His brother had fought in the Texas Revolution, and they came here and settled in the Guadalupe County. He was a lawyer. He had a huge ranch, and he decided, had an entrepreneurial spirit. At that time, the gold rush was taking place in California. It cost, if you wanted to buy a herd of cow in California at the time, it cost you $100. You could buy a cow in Texas at that time for $5, and Michael Erskine decided that he was going to march or take 1,000 head of cattle to California and sell them and create a fortune. He hired James Hughes, can you imagine, 1854, driving a herd of cattle from Seguin, Texas, all the way to Warner's Ranch in California, which is what he hired James Hughes Callahan to be the ramrod. He was the guide for the entire trip. They started in April. They ended up in October or sometime. It took them about 6 months. Michael Erskine kept a diary of this cattle drive, an important historical record which has been published in a book, by the way. He wrote about how far they traveled, what kind of grass and water they had, what kind of problems they had. They talked about Indian raids. They talked about meeting other people on the trail. But we know exactly the kind of environment this cattle herd passed through going to California in 1854. And I write extensively about it. I also, there were, as far as I could document, there were 25 herds that left Texas at that time to go to California. That was about 25,000 head of cattle. That was not the most cattle that went to California. About 125,000 head came from the Midwest part of the United States to California. And they were all headed there to make a fortune. Of the 25, I documented 25 head of the 25 herds, and I followed their fate. There was one of them, nobody survived. None of the animals survived, none of the people survived. They were all killed in an Indian raid in Mexico, by the way. But in one of these cattle drives, a cattle driver also kept a diary. So now I had two sources of information about what occurred in a typical cattle drive in 1854 from Texas to California. By the way, Michael Erskine bought a pair of pistols and a rifle and a shotgun for everybody that he hired. He hired about 25 men to help wrangle the cattle to California. Within 3 days, 3 of them had run away. He got his horses back and most of his guns back. And when he got to El Paso, several more quit. He had to hire some more. But nevertheless, they ended up in California. Out of this herd, there was actually 1,090 head of cattle. There were almost 900 left when they arrived. Of all the herds that went to California that year, it had the highest survival rate, and about half of the ones that disappeared because they slaughtered them for food. And he claimed that James Hughes Callahan was the main reason that they survived. During the trip to California, they had 2 skirmishes. One was near what is now a little bit east of Fort Davis, and the other was inside of Mexico along the San Pedro River. I found several accounts of people who participated in these skirmishes. That some of them hadn't been published, and I incorporated those into the story. But this was a cattle drive that James Hughes Callahan led to California in 1854. So now Callahan returns back to Texas. His partners in the land company, it was the Pittsburgh Land Company. One was William Early Jones. This is William Early Jones, a distinguished looking guy, isn't he? He was a lawyer. He was also a member of the Texas, Republic of Texas legislature. He found in newspapers, the San Antonio Express, he found after the Civil War, by the way, still exists today. He was a unionist. In the Civil War, he set out the war. After the war, he became a judge again. But back to the Pittsburgh Land Company. This is the Blanco River. This is Pittsburgh. Today, Blanco City is right here. Callahan's house was located here, and Callahan had one half of this survey right here. He had the best half, the southern half, which included the Blanco River. He sold some land to various people. One was the Blassingame family. We will come back to them. So now he had some money to invest into the Pittsburgh Land Company. This is 1855. William Early Jones was a prolific letter writer. He was a drum beater. He claimed that they couldn't survive. The land company would go broke if the Indian raids didn't stop. He constantly wrote letters to the governor. And he would describe the Indian raids that were taking place during this time. Finally, he visits the governor of Texas, and he says the best person to put in charge to stop Indian raids is a former ranger company headed by James Hughes Callahan, which the governor sent Callahan a letter and asked him to do that, and he did. He formed a ranger company of about almost 90 men, and now becomes the Callahan expedition, the most famous historical event that historians have written about associated with James Hughes Callahan, the Callahan expedition. It occurred in the fall of 1855. When Callahan formed his ranger, he formed a protective line all the way north of Fredericksburg down near Camp Bandera. And there are various newspaper articles, and there are also letters and other documents written by men who have served in the Callahan expedition to describe some of the events that took place here. Nevertheless, Indian raids periodically continued, and Callahan told the governor, actually the governor told him that he could follow them anywhere that he felt he needed to. He decided to follow them into Mexico, which he proceeded to do. And here is the route that he took and the dates and so forth, and he ends up at Eagle Pass at Fort Duncan. Fort Duncan had a fort at that time. The man in charge of the fort, the man in charge of the fort, his name was Burbank, wrote articles about what occurred of the Callahan expedition. As I said, Callahan decided that he would chastise the Indians inside of Mexico. These were the Lapon Indians that he felt were causing the trouble. He had with him a man who had a colored past. He was related to Patrick Henry. And anyway, they all congregate and they eventually cross the river. The farther they get into the river, the more the Mexican army, let me back up just a little bit. Mexico defended itself against Indians by having very effective militia in villages. They were not as well armed as Texas Rangers were. but they were experienced fighters against Indians. At this time, there were political turmoil occurring in Mexico. The commander of the Mexican forces across from Eagle Pass, his name was Langberg. He was a Dutch man from Holland that moved to Mexico and became a colonel. This is not uncommon, by the way, for foreigners to do that in the Mexican army. He was currying the favor of the man who wanted to be the power in northern Mexico against Santa Anna. And so this guy's name was Vidari. So there's a lot of turmoil occurring in northern Mexico, and Vidari was asking for Langberg to send him troops. He was organizing the militias into an army to move and to help Vidari. It denuded the frontier of Mexican militia, made it easy for Callahan to penetrate. But the farther he got into it, the more the Mexican government decided this was the wrong thing to do, and Langberg decided to return back towards Eagle Pass. In the meantime, he sent instructions to fight. There was a skirmish inside of Mexico on what's called a skirmish at the Rio Escondido. Callahan and he decided this was the wrong thing to do and retreated back to Piedras Negras. He was still inside Mexico. And by that time, it was total turmoil. All the Mexican people in the village had fled. It was a village of straw houses. And there began to be skirmishes among the Mexican militia and Callahan. Callahan even ordered that the village was burned down. All this is written up in historical accounts, by the way, in newspapers. And eventually Callahan withdraws across the river. This is a skirmish here at Rio Escondido. What I did unique here is these are, the image in the background are photographs made by the U.S. government about 1955, more or less. I overlaid on the photograph the description in the exact location where it occurred, the description of where the where the troops were outlined in the skirmish. It's something that hasn't been done before. But anyway, this is one of the men that fought. He was the Callahan Rangers. His name was his last name was Walton. We'll see another one of him. Isn't that a neat photograph? It's in Sul Ross University. They gave me permission to publish it. It's first published in this book. Handsome guy, wasn't he? So anyway, Callahan pulled back across the river. The governor chastised him and disbanded his rangers, and the Callahan expedition is over with. And of course it's called an international incident. And there's all kinds of political intrigue from the President of the United States to the President of Mexico, the local ambassadors and consuls and so forth. And Callahan even threatened to reinvade Mexico and even started to collect his troops again, but decided better that he needed to quit, and he did. That's the Callahan expedition. Some historians claim that it was for recovery of slaves. Slaves escaped, and some escaped across the river at this point. I concluded that was not the case. It was there to defend their investment in the Pittsburgh Land Company. And I wrote about this, and I wrote about the two historians who wrote about it and claimed it was slave recovery. And I described why I disagreed with them. Callahan returns home. It is late October, and he starts taking care of his cattle and getting ready for the spring plantings and so forth. He had sold land to Woodson Blassingame, who had a son. He and his son and his wife, Woodson's wife, lived in the Blassingame cabin, which they built on property that they bought from Callahan. And it is unclear but a dispute occurred between the Callahan family and the Blasingame family. One story that Callahan's daughter told is that Woodson's son came to the house to asked to borrow a shotgun from Callahan, and he willingly lent it, and at that time Callahan complained to him about that his father was starting rumors about his family, and he wanted that to stop. What the rumors were are all kinds of speculation, which I reviewed in the book, and I'm never certain exactly of what they were, or what caused Callahan to decide that he would go. He said he would go to the visit Woodson Blasingame, and he took two of his buddies with him, William S. Johnson and E.C. Hines. Thomas Johnson, this is William S. Johnson's son, went with them as well. And they pull up to the cabin. By the way, that cabin still exists today. That's a photograph of the cabin. So this is facing south. This is the door here. They were on this side. And they arrive, and Mrs. Blasingame comes to the south door. And Callahan says, "Is your husband here?" She starts to answer, and he is immediately killed with a shotgun blast. And a second shotgun blast kills William S. Johnson, and the third one wounded Hines. His horse reared when the first shot, and by the time they shot him, it was a glancing blow. By that time, Thomas Johnson, who had driven a herd of horses somewhere, came back, and he started the shooting at the Blasingame family. This is the Callahan-Blasingame affair. It's covered in 3 chapters, and I discuss it extensively. In the summary, the Blasingame were arrested. They were hauled off to a cow pen, probably, for the jail in a village south of there called Middletown. And soon a group of men came and captured them, shot Blasingame and his son, and his wife ran off. And in other words, they killed them. And this was in Comal County. The Germans in Comal County were upset, and they had all of the men that were guarding, had them arrested for murder. Eventually they were all found either innocent or not guilty. The charges were dismissed. The district attorney of Comal County then had 3 of Callahan's brother-in-laws arrested. And it took several years before these cases were finally dismissed or they were found not guilty. I discussed the Blasingame-Callahan affair further extensively. Callahan has a probate. I've looked at several probates. This is what his possessions looked like in 1856. He was killed in April of 1856. 5 bedsteads, 3 mattresses, 8 quilt tops, 3 counterpane, 5 blankets. Look at all this. He lived a life not shy of goods. The Blasingame probate is much more thin. She's pregnant, and she dies in September. The child dies also. Callahan was buried in the Blanco Cemetery beside a son that had previously died the year earlier while he was on the Callahan expedition. And then she dies in September, and she's buried beside him in unmarked graves. The probate continued until 1870. There were 3 administrators, and I'm not going to discuss the probate in detail. I wind up by following all of the Callahan girls and their husbands. This is James Milford Day. This is Elizabeth Day Hankins. She married Eli Hankins, and they lived in Prairie League. These are the only photographs I could find, other than the one I showed you earlier, Sarah Medici's Day, of any of these folks. This man here and this man here are descendants of James Milford Day. I met my cousins tonight here. Callahan and his wife were disinterred in the 1930s and reburied in the state cemetery. This is a photograph of their tombstone on the front side, on the back side. So that's, in a nutshell, the story. Now I want to tell you about my process. I wanted the book to meet academic historian standards, and I wanted it published by an academic press. That's the kind of imprint that I wanted to leave in the historical community. I'm very good at collecting data. I am the worst writer you ever saw. I'm not any good. I collected a lot of digital data, prepared tables and maps, and I drafted a narrative, and I asked historians to critique every chapter. I must have asked several historians to read various chapters. One of them was a man who was editor of the University of Oklahoma Press, who knew about cattle drives, and he reviewed the chapter on the cattle drives, and he told me, when you're ready to publish the book, I want first crack at it, and that's why it was published by the University of Oklahoma Press. I used professional editors to polish the manuscript. That was not an inexpensive process. I told you I was an awful writer. I didn't want to fool with writing endnotes or bibliography by the standards today, and one of those people did for me. I used newspapers. Fortunately, at the time I started writing this, there was an explosion of digital newspapers that easily accessible. One of them was a Portal for Texas History, sponsored by the University of North Texas. Newspapers on .com. I found the University State Archives and overseas, and including Mexican newspapers that are all digital and available online. Newspapers published by the New Braunfels Zeitung. This is a German newspaper published then. I had digital copies made, and I actually gave it to the Portal of Texas History. And fortunately, I worked with a lady that was well versed in Old German, and she translated a lot of the articles for me. So I used newspapers became a major source of information for newspapers published at that time. I also used county deeds, probate, tax rolls, county minutes, and county records. These are all county minutes. Let me see, deeds, probate, tax rolls, and court minutes you can find at the Texas Archives. They have given permission to various organizations to copy some of them and put them online, particularly tax rolls. And you can find those, and they're easily available. District court records is a different story. It's the records for each court case, and these are maintained still by the district clerk, although many have disappeared. Anyway, I had all of these. I copied every one of these made digital copies of everything. These are, I said, the Texas State Library and Archive. FamilySearch.org is where you can get a lot of tax rolls. I worked with a lot of county clerks and district clerks to collect a lot of this information. At the state level, I had muster rolls, government correspondence, legislative records, and laws, and a lot of this, by the way, is still digitized and online and easily available. And when it wasn't, I asked them to make copies for me, and they did. These are at the Texas State Library, the Texas General Office, various local libraries, and the survey maps come out of the Texas General Land Office. Nationally, I use the census, agricultural census, war records, land records, by the way, Secretary of State records, ship passenger list, Department of Defense correspondent, and so forth. If you're not familiar, at that time they did agricultural censuses every 10 years. If you were living in a county, they came to you and said, how many horses do you own, how many pigs? They inventoried everything. So you can get a pretty good idea of how the lifestyle and the wealth of a person was by looking at these agricultural records. I went to Mexico City 3 times, went to Saltillo 3 times, looking at state archives, newspapers. Thank goodness a lot of these were online. This is the military archives in Mexico City, very difficult to get in. I had a friend down there, and I went and visited them twice. I wanted to look at an individual's records, which were not online, but all of the correspondence that Mexican authorities shared among each other in the military archive, every bit of it has been scanned and is online. There's been some collection at the University of Texas, and this is the most important one, the Yale, the Musquis records. That's a village south of Piedras Negras. One of the legacies of the Spanish government is they imprinted into Mexico is you record and copy. If you write a letter, you copy everybody. So if I wrote a letter to you, and I would have copies made, and it would go to many different people. So there's a lot of correspondence that exists in Mexico. They took censuses every year. But this man, a man, was writing a book on the northern history of Mexico, and he got all of this the city records from Musquis in his hands, and they ended up at Yale University. He wrote a 1,000-page manuscript on, this is onion paper on both sides, about this area, northern Coahuila, Mexico. It ended up in Yale University. They copied a lot of the records for me, but anyway, that was a major source of information. I wanted to know who the people were. Why were they there? Who they were. I looked at books written, and to find them, looked at Ancestry.com. Everybody that was in any muster roll, I looked on Ancestry.com, and if you look on Ancestry, somebody wrote that Ancestry, and they left their contact information, and I wrote them a note and said, here's what I'm doing, do you have any information on this person? And lo and behold, about 50 people responded to me. I got photographs and correspondence that historians had never seen. This was David Alfred Theophilus D.A.T. Walton. That was the man I showed you earlier. He moved to western part of Texas. This is his family, I think, somewhere. I'm not sure exactly when, but his age, hasn't he? I found 6 unpublished diaries. I copied every one of them. This one is my 4-great-grandmother, Sarah Hembry Day. This is Sarah Medici's Day's mother. She kept a prayer journal. She wrote every Sunday from 1846 until she died, shortly before she died in 1856. The diary exists in one of our descendants, one of her descendants' hands. I got a copy of it. I've been after her to put it in an archive because I know at some point it will disappear. Anyway, I got several other diaries, including one written by a German lady in New Braunfels. And all of these diaries had information of one nature or another that I used and incorporated into the book. Like I said, many of these had never been seen by historians. So I had used 4 editors, take it back. And all of them made my prose sound much better. I had one person that made my endnotes and bibliography, turn it into scribbles that I gave her into something that met the standards of publishing today. Now, when I finished the manuscript, it was 920,000 words. I was proud. 2 volumes. And I sent it to my contact at the University of Oklahoma Press. And he sent me a note back in a couple hours. It's too big. I said, Kevin, you didn't read it. He said, it's 920,000 words. It's too big. I can't do it. You've got to reduce it. How many? 450,000 words. I said, okay. And he put me in contact with Richard McCaslin, who've done this with other people. He used to teach at UNT. And I did. I reduced it down to 520,000 words. And that's what the book is published on, it's 520,000 words. I had put a lot of notes into the endnotes. When I run across a person, I wrote little sentences about them. I eliminated all of those. And I learned how to condense. And I did. I changed it to 520,000 words. Anyway, it went through a peer review critique. I talked about the length of the manuscript, went through 2 or 3 internal reviews, and finally everything, and it was published and promoted. And that, so the main thing I learned about writing, looking at it from a publisher's viewpoint, don't make it too long. The next book, my second book, is being published. He told me that normally books are 150,000 words. And the next book I wrote is 150,000 words, and it's being published by the TCU Press. I gave it to them, and they said it's too long. So I need 20,000 words cut. So anyway, I took care of that. I'm going to stop there. I appreciate your time. And I do have a few books. If you want to buy one, I'll send it to you, or I'll take cash or check. But I'll entertain any questions you have for me.
What's the second book?
It's about Alcon Laboratories, where I worked for 40 years. Alcon became the premier and dominant ophthalmic pharmaceutical company in the world, and I participated in that process.
When you were talking about Seguin, they're still a good school. We competed against them in high school. They're tough.
They were.
You mentioned the agriculture census. When did that stop?
I'm not real sure, but I'm pretty sure it stopped in the 1800s sometime. I don't think it existed after 1900.
They're
Right.
still doing an ag.
Huh?
They're still doing an ag
If you
census.
thought about filled out.
Oh, they do? They
Yeah.
still do it?
Well, yeah, they send you a deal and how many do you have, how
Yeah.
many land, how much.
Okay, so
Yeah.
they still do
But
it.
it's not really a census to me, like the census used to be.
But back then, you got an option to do it, to answer right, I assume, right?
No, they want you to answer.
Yeah. If not, they'll keep reminding you,
Okay.
when are you doing it, when are you doing it?
Because I guess they may still do it. As far as the regular census, I can remember as a kid, knock at the door coming up.
Oh, yeah.
My mother answering
Oh, yeah.
all the
Oh, yeah.
questions, which nobody's knocked on my door in a long time, but
Yeah.
I do live pretty far out, but
Yeah.
that's all right.
They mail it to you now.
Okay, that's probably true, it's redone.
Anyway, that was my story, my 3 journeys, and my learning to be an author. And I'm starting on my 3rd book now. And I'll be 83 years old in March. I need to stay mentally active. This is one avenue.
And what's that book gonna be?
I'm not real sure. I'm writing some essays about events and people that I've occurred in my life. I will tell you one story. One of them is a blind taxi cab driver that I had in Singapore.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Anyway, I appreciate you all's time.
Does anybody have any more questions for Dr. McDonald? Well, I just want to say real quick again, I read this book cover to cover, and I couldn't recommend it higher. And not just because my family's involved. I had a bunch of relatives that were in Captain Callahan's company for the Callahan expedition, and that were in the other captains groups that were on that expedition as well. I had some, my 4th great-grandfather was the sheriff that was supposed to be arresting some folks from the Blasting Game affair, and he never did. But one of them was one of the cousin, or uncle rather, was one of the outlaws that managed to escape arrest from that Blasting Game affair. He was supposed to be one of the guards. But anyways, even if I didn't have all those relatives in the book, it's a really great read, and I highly recommend it. Dr. McDonald's got several for $30, and he'll sign it for you. So be sure to get one if you haven't. And he was kind enough to donate one to the library, so it'll be available for everybody in Sanger to check out. So thank you again, Dr. McDonald.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight.